Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hello, I'm Tricia Class, today's host. We have a guest today, Dr. Terry Husband, Assistant Professor in Curriculum and Instruction. He teaches early childhood education, literacy, and student diversity classes. The research we'll discuss today blends those three areas of his interest. He examined in this study race, culture, and gender issues related to why Black males struggle with reading and what can be done to address those issues. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And when I read this article, you provided some very compelling national data about reading underachievement in Black males. Could you summarize and interpret that data you used in your research and talk about how you've seen these data played out in schools that you work with?
Sure, absolutely. We think about the data came from the U.S. Department of Education, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which in short is a summary of assessments that nationally the United States Department of Education conducts at grades 4, grades 8, and grades 12 to see how students are performing in reading, math, science, social studies, etc. And so one of the things that was blaring about that particular data set was that we think about the achievement gap. We think about how it sort of develops even early into fourth grade and then continues throughout. We think about there's sort of a ranking when it comes to males in reading. So we think about at the top, there's typically Asian American students who score the highest. Then second are typically white male students. And then there were Hispanic male students, American Indians, and the African American males were at the bottom. But what sort of struck out to me the most was when we think about the very highest performers or composite scores. Asian American boys, they typically scored roughly around 230 on the test out of 250. And then African American boys scored only 200. So you begin to think about, even as early as fourth grade, there's roughly a 30-point difference. With the difference between African American males and white males was roughly 27 points. And so that implies two particular questions for us as teachers and teachers educators. Number one, what can we do to sort of stop this runaway train? So for grades 5, 12. Mm-hmm. And then number two, particularly in my area, what's happening or is not happening in grades pre-K through third that's sort of contributing to these kinds of issues. And so that's sort of where I began to unpack this article and began to consider the research. The secondary piece with that data is that it's sort of generally known in literacy circles that there's a gap between boys and girls when it comes to reading. You know, girls, mm-hmm. For whatever reason, they tend to like books a little bit more than boys, and they tend to excel more. Well, what was interesting to me was when I explored the female groups, one of the things I found is that compared to every other ethnic group, every other racial group, African American boys were still at the bottom, even compared to African American girls. And so, again, using that same score of roughly 200, you would find that Asian American girls typically scored like 242 on that same mm-hmm. exact measure. Then white girls were typically secondary. Hispanic and African American girls were typically tied for third, and then Native American girls, and then African American boys were even lower. And so one of the things that it brought to my attention was there's a lot of work that actually needs to be done, and so that's sort of where this article, the idea behind it, kind of took place. I began to explore. When we think about African American boys, they're part of two groups that have historically underperformed in reading, both boys mm-hmm. and both African American males, and so began to unpack some of those factors along the way.
Right, that's where you started in the article. I saw you had the gender mm-hmm. literature, the race and ethnic literature, and how that both impacts Black males. That they, as you're saying, there was just not only race, but the ethnic and gender.
Absolutely. We think about both sort of, if we were to disaggregate both kinds of positionalities in the world. So African American boys in particular are impacted by both gender issues mm-hmm. and racial/cultural issues. Think about some of the gender issues, for example, we think about in classrooms. A lot of times, either knowingly or unknowingly, boys don't have access to literature that actually speaks to their reading interests. So you think about, if I were to say to you, name your top 10 favorite pieces of children's literature. Most of those interests tend to speak to what girls like to read about. Boys tend to like to read about humor, informational text, text about a scary text. But most of the literature we use in classrooms don't necessarily speak to that. And so we think about this engagement piece. It becomes more difficult to read or teach reading if I'm not necessarily interested in the content that we have access to reading. So that's one particular factor. The other piece deals with how students actually read. There's this idea of what we call from Rosenblatt, I'm not sure you're familiar with that, but this idea of aesthetic reading versus efferent. So aesthetic reading has to do with personal experiences, it has to do with memories. When we sort of read the text and say, what does this mean to you? How does this relate? Well, efferent reading has to do with more of the concrete analytical pieces. In most early childhood classrooms or early elementary classrooms, again, the tendency is for teachers to focus on what we call aesthetic reading, which again speaks to girls' ways of reading versus boys' reading. There was a study by Clarkey in 2006, I believe, in the 4th, 5th grade classroom, where she talked about how even in literature circles, girls tend to dominate because they're sort of reading with their own tools and by their own rules. When we sort of say, well, here's the book, discuss it with everybody in the group, how does it make you feel? Where boys tend to be silenced by that kind of instruction. And so, again, a lot of that's sort of unconscious, but a lot of those things we think about engagement, we think about why boys tend to be more resistant towards reading. Most of us don't necessarily like to do activities that we're not necessarily pleased with.
Well, and that's the third part, I think, what's interesting about your study. You talk about changes educators could actually implement in their classroom, and it seems like you're giving a hint of one of them right now. What are some things that you thought teachers could do to help address this issue, just in changing in practice or reading selection?
Absolutely. 3 simple things I think teachers can do is, number one, to begin to include more texts that speak to cultural and socially relevant material, so boys are more engaged. Number 2, to begin to do or implement what we call culturally responsive literacy instruction. So using the cultural frames of reference, the cultural material, the cultural value systems of the particular group of African American boys in the classroom as the foundation or the bridge to teach whatever the core content actually is. And sort of saying, these are the students in my classroom, how can I make this relevant to the content? What we do oftentimes is do the reverse. We say, this is the core curriculum, let me sort of make the bridge backwards, and a lot of times we leave students along the way. And then the third piece is just to rethink how we do disciplinary procedures in most classrooms. We know there's a ton of data that talks about how African American boys and Hispanic boys, for example, are disproportionately suspended and expelled from school. Well, there's a direct correlation between time out of class and reading skills, particularly in early childhood. So if I miss, let's say, for example, 5 or 7 days out of the year in 1st grade, that's the year where we're supposed to learn how to read. Now, because reading is a developmental process, a subsequent activity, that if I miss those days now in 2nd and 3rd grade, I'm going to struggle as a result. And so we want to think about how can we keep them in the classroom while we're managing discipline as opposed to pushing them out of the classroom.
Okay, that's good. And one exciting thing I learned was that you were invited to write a book that's a follow-up to this article, that someone read your article and now you're writing a book. And so can you tell us a little bit about your book and how you're going to expand from this initial article?
Sure. The book kind of continues along the same lines. The working title right now is Improving Literacy Outcomes in African American Boys. And I use the notion of outcomes versus exclusively achievement, because there's this idea of in reading engagement. So we want African American boys to ultimately become lifelong learners and love books and fall in love with books in much of the same way that girls often do. But then achievement scores as well. And so one of the things that the book, one of the premises within the book is this idea of what I call a multifaceted framework. Because a lot of these same factors, they not only deal with just the curriculum or pedagogy, they deal with things outside of the classroom, school-wide. And so this multi-strategic framework for teachers, for administrators, for even parents, to engage each other in sort of a collective, broad partnership to sort of say, well, these are some things that parents and librarians can do. These are some things that administrators can do. These are some things that curriculum developers can do collectively in a unilateral way to actually work towards it. Because my overall argument is that just by dealing with curriculum, we won't be able to produce the results that we actually want and they actually deserve. And so it kind of gets to some of those things and talks about some of those different kinds of strategies.
Good. And when do you expect the book to be out?
Sometime early fall 2013. And so the manuscript in its entirety is due in late spring. And so once we kind of go through the revision process, I'm anticipating hopefully early fall or by late fall, maybe November, December, something
Okay,
like that.
well, that'll be exciting that how you've expanded it and really all those multiple audiences. That's
I'm
really
excited about
good.
that too.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure today's conversation will entice others to read your article and then perhaps your book when it comes out next year. Well, thanks a lot, Terry.
Thank you for having me.
The full citation for today's article is Husband T, February 2012. Why Can't Jamal Read? Phi Delta Kappan, 93, number 5, pages 23 to 27. The full text is available through Milner Library and other university libraries. The citation can also be found at the website coe.ilstu.edu/research/podcasts. Good day. Please join us again for future research breaks.
Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.